Welcome to another edition of NPPF Flashpoint. This is where we consider the current draft NPPF and areas in which people are interested in what has happened in terms of change of policy, what's proposed by way of change of policy, and further improvements that can be made. I'm joined by Angie Fenton and Christian Hawley. Christian is a junior barrister in number 5 Chambers, and Angie Fenton really needs no introduction. She's a very well-known figure, a senior director at Quod, a member of the British Property Federation's Industrial Committee and the London Industrial and Logistics Sounding Board. First of all then, Angie, thank you very much for joining us. And my first question is, what do you think of the NPPF economic policies? Do they go far enough?
Hi, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to speak in your podcast. With regard to your first question, do they go far enough? Chapter 7 on building a strong, effective economy is largely unchanged, but there is a notably more support for economic growth running through the draft NPPF, which is welcomed by the sector. The main change is that in policy E3, we now have the first national policy specifically for freight and logistics, which recognises that the sector has specific locational and operational needs. We also have stronger weighting in decision making and clearer support where unmet need exists. So considering this is one of the key foundation sectors of the economy, I do think that the government could go a bit further to support freight and logistics. It is great news that substantial weight is now given to the sector and to commercial development as a whole, but this doesn't really marry up with the very strong focus on housing over economic development throughout the NPPF. The focus on national policy has always prioritised delivering new homes, and probably rightly so in all fairness. But what the NPPF does not consider is that if the government were to succeed in the drive to deliver 1.5 million homes, it would result in a need for almost 7 square metres of additional logistics floor space per household. Now that's over 10 million square metres of additional floor space for new households alone. And that's not even touching on the need generated by things like nearshoring, reshoring, defence spending, and the real push to deliver more and more data centres. We have policy PM1 in particular refers to economic and employment uses as other uses or job creation. But for those who work in the sector, we do consider that industrial and logistics, it should be given the same status as housing throughout the NPPF. I and many people in the sector think that the NPPF could generally provide a lot more. For example, by adding freight and logistics to the list of priority sectors in policy E1 as a start. But in saying that, this version of the NPPF has been given relative support, and the upgrade from significant to substantial weight to economic development is very positive. I think that the government does place value on the sector, but I still just don't think they quite understand its unique operational requirements and the contribution it provides to UK PLC, both nationally and internationally.
Yeah, you make some very interesting points, but there's no doubt the document is largely focused on housing, isn't it? As you say, There just isn't the same emphasis in employment. Okay, well, I'm going to hand over to Christian, and he's got some questions.
Hello, Angie. Lovely to see you.
Hi, Christian.
Obviously, we're at that stage of the year where our now almost certain annual revision of the NPPF has taken place, and we're in the consultation stage, wondering where it's all going to land. There's lots going on in the document as a whole, but specifically in terms of the sector we're considering today and the evolution of policy over the last few years. Is it any different, materially so?
I think that the increase in weighting for commercial development from significant to substantial is potentially a big change in this draft. But otherwise, there's not a lot of change in 2024, aside from the new policy E3, which I mentioned, which recognises that freight and logistics have specific locational needs. There's also reference to last mile logistics in policy E1, and there's also recognition that the economy changes faster than planning policy and that market forces need to be considered with regard to the need for logistics development. I think the 2024 NPPF was when material changes to national policy for the sector really came in. This 24 NPPF introduced a modern economy and naming the 4 sectors of gigafactories, digital infrastructure, laboratories, and freight and logistics as those sectors that make up the modern economy. And local planning authorities were also asked in 2024 to specifically identify land for logistics, whereas previously in the 2017 version, they just had to meet employment needs generally. So there are some changes, but the main changes really were brought in 24, I think.
Okay, so evolution in terms of an increased focus and some more direction. I think, Chris, you were going to ask about how that feeds through into the plan-making process.
Thank you, Christian. We have this new format for the NPPF. We've actually got policies in there, and it all starts with the plan-making policies. What are your thoughts on the plan-making policies as they affect the logistics and industrial sector?
PM1 will be the first one we have to consider, which provides emphasis, as we know, on every plan having a clear role in the planning hierarchy. Spatial development strategies will be important for freight and logistics, but the sector should be given specific reference and the same footing as housing, rather than just slipping it in under the term of new jobs or commercial development. It will also be interesting to see how the objectively assessed needs will be apportioned. Will standardised employment land reviews ever be introduced to produce OANs for employment development, or will that just continue to be relevant to housing? Policy PM8 provides a requirement that evidence for plan making shouldn't be unnecessarily complicated. Now, this is positive and a pragmatic approach that will help with new studies on the modern economy needs. But in reality, most employment land reviews are already out of date by the time they are published. So I don't think it really is very practical for employment development unless a standardised approach is brought in at some stage. And with digital planning on the horizon, hopefully we will see digital employment land reviews in the future that should help with cooperation between local authorities in gathering evidence for plan making.
What about policy S5? Everybody's talking about policy S5, development outside settlements. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that certainly is a big one for logistics. Part J2 of this policy demonstrates such strong support that the government is giving to freight and logistics. It recognises the sites that are suitable for strategic logistics are rarely within a settlement. But even more positively, and later on in the economy chapter 7, we see that market need can be used to justify major development for storage and distribution. And this really is a very welcome addition.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole document is focused on, yes, you're not meant to build outside settlement boundaries, but if there's a need for development, it will be welcomed. And really, there's need for everything, isn't there? Including not just housing and all forms of accommodation, but all forms of economic development. So it's just a case of getting your need case sorted out, isn't it, really, I think? And what about policies in the E section? So E1 is providing the conditions for long-term economic growth. What relevance does that have to logistics and industrial?
Yeah, policy E1 increases emphasis on sustainable economic growth, which is positive, and requires development plans to have regard to the industrial strategy zones and the AI growth zones when developing planning policies. Part CI and CII of this policy they're carried forward from the current NPPF, reinforcing the importance of high-tech facilities and storage and distribution facilities. That these are key growth sectors and key economic infrastructure supporting the wider economy. So it is welcome that those are brought forward. The problem we do have with the modern economy, and in particular the data center sector faces, is that we are planning for unknown needs. And those working in the data sector and developing AI, even they don't know how AI will develop or what our data storage needs will be in 1 or 5 years' time. So unlike housing, which we can have a go at population forecasts, it's very, very difficult to plan for the long-term real estate needs of what the government is referring to as the modern economy.
Yeah, how true is that? I mean, not even Elon Musk knows where AI is going. Nobody knows, in truth. So how do you plan for that? What about E12? What are your thoughts there?
Another positive policy, it requires flexibility in the allocation of commercial sites. Some of the wording has been lost from the current NPPF at paragraph 86E. Regarding the need of development plan policies to be able to respond rapidly to changes in economic circumstances. We do think that, when I say we, the sector and the groups that I'm involved in have been discussing this, we think that it should explicitly state that policies relating to new commercial development should contain flexibility to allow businesses to adapt and respond to changes in economic circumstances. For example, in London, we are seeing significant viability constraints with affordable workspace policies, which are just putting unnecessary pressure on commercial sites and effectively are preventing the fast delivery of modern economic floor space.
Yeah, I mean, there's an irony there, isn't there? You have policies that are designed to encourage economic development, but actually the detail of them inhibits a change to a more modern economy at what is a time of enormous and rapid change. I'm going to hand back to Christian then, because I know he wants to ask you about the decision-making policies.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's plan making, but not everything ends up being planned for. There's plenty of proposals that are often needed, which aren't foreseen through the plan making process. We've got a heading straight after plan making, national decision making policies, and that's where we find E2, meeting the need for business land and premises. And it just piqued my interest really, because of course meeting the need for business land and premises is the role of the prior section, the plan making section, but this clearly recognises that we're going to be in the decision making world as well in order to meet the need for business land and premises. So given that employment land is often quite difficult to calculate in any particular detail, given changing needs and changing markets, is this policy E2, do you think it's helpful to those seeking to deliver schemes or unhelpful?
I think it is helpful. Like, the weighting given to proposals for commercial development has been increased from significant to substantial. So we have to say this is a very positive change, and it provides a positive recognition to the importance of the sector. On part E22A, I think that if it's applied correctly, allowing applicants to use market signals to demonstrate an unmet need is a very positive addition. And it recognises how sensitive commercial development is to the strength of and changes in the wider economy. I do think that the government or MHCLG could add another point to Part B of E22 by requiring local planning authorities to release low quality industrial and logistics space to change to other uses, whether that be commercial, if there's demand for other commercial uses, including town centre uses, or residential. There really are too many outdated industrial sites in towns and cities around the country that just cannot accommodate the needs of modern industrial and logistics companies. And those sites often sit empty as they're just protected by outdated policies.
Okay, thank you. So then specific sectors which are identified in the framework, and that's where we find immediately after E3, dealing with freight and logistics, often described as the backbone of the economy or the artery of the economy. It's been a sector which obviously has hit the headlines significantly over the last few years. Really the rise during COVID of internet shopping and distribution, etc. So we've now got E3, which is dealing solely with freight and logistics. The introduction of a specific policy, if you look at what commentators are saying, it seems to have been received positively. How do you think, even if it's a good start, it could be improved to support this critical sector?
As you say, Christian, it is very positive to have a specific focus on freight and logistics. And it shows that the government is recognising the specific needs of this sector. But there are some areas that need a bit more clarification. For example, clarification should be provided on the meaning of co-location and intensification, which are referred to in the second part of the policy. And by this I mean clarification that co-location does not mean co-location with residential or other sensitive uses, which we have seen in London in particular is very, very challenging to deliver, even if planning permission is granted. Due to just specific occupier needs, it's often also not possible to even co-locate with commercial uses. So some clarity on that could be provided within a footnote, I think, of the NPPF, and we'll respond in that regard. Similarly with intensification, we need some clarity to avoid lengthy discussions, which I expect will happen on how to interpret the policy. And this already has happened in the London plan, which promoted intensification back in 2021. But, it's intensification of what? Is it intensification of jobs? Is it intensification of floor space, yard space, cubic space? So we do need some clarity on that, just to avoid more discussions and arguments on how to interpret that policy. We've already been through it in the London plan over the years.
Okay, so a new policy, but one that you consider is ripe for further evolution, but not too much of a straitjacket, because I think a constant theme that we hear is that flexibility is key as well. So those are the specific policies which have changed as part, or are proposed to be changed as part of the proposed framework. Of course, last time round, and still settling in, the framework revisions introduced grey belt. There aren't any particular changes in this iteration so far as what we're discussing today. What do you say about green belt and grey belt changes and how this new version of the framework would affect the sector?
Well, there's no real change, as you say, Christian, to the green belt, grey belt. And I think the sector is still getting to grips with the whole concept of grey belt. If a logistics development complies with the golden rules and is delivering substantial public benefit, there potentially are a lot more land options near urban areas or strategic corridors, and especially for last mile and regional distribution facilities. But I think, as grey belt becomes more established and ingrained in policy, it will definitely reduce some of the barriers that have hampered development sites on green belts.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, grey belt is the single biggest policy change in British planning since probably 1948. I think the reality is that large areas of the greenbelt are suitable for development, and we see data centres being allowed in greenbelts. Yeah, I think there's huge potential here. It just redefines the whole way we look upon the greenbelt, actually, in my opinion. Look, is there anything else, Angie, in terms of aspects of the NPPF that you'd like to draw people's attention to?
Yeah, there's transport obviously is very relevant to logistics development. They go hand in hand. Draft policy TR3 may have a conflict with policy E3 by requiring high movement uses where they limit the need to travel. So whilst policy E3 and S5 support freight and logistics outside settlements, where sustainable travel methods will be limited, there's certainly a conflict there in how some local authorities will interpret that, and may use policy TR3 to refuse development, while policy E3 and S5 should be supporting it. So it's just something to pick up on. As well, Transport Policy 5 provides support for quality roadside facilities for drivers and also protects current roadside facilities. We do often see and hear from the logistics industry, and it's often on national news as well, about the shortage of roadside facilities for lorry drivers, and in particular quality roadside facilities that provide some sleeping areas and good hot food overnight and so on. So that's quite positive. And then the other two that I think everyone has picked up on, policy DM2, new validation requirements. I think that will be a huge positive for just speeding up validation. And a DM3D, which requires LPAs not to delay decisions because they're waiting on statutory consultees. I think that's also very important because it is, on the day-to-day at the coalface, we are working on planning applications. These are delays that we're experiencing every day.
Good. I'll hand over to Christian then for our final question.
Yeah, so obviously we're dealing here with this year's framework, or indeed last year's publication. If we transport ourselves forward a little bit, and it seems so far away at the minute, but if you were writing a list to Santa for this Christmas coming and we were to have further iterations to the framework, what would your key asks be?
I think the first thing would ask for more flexibility to ensure that employment sites can come forward outside the formal local plan cycle. And this could happen via criteria-based policies. And mainly because, with the unexpected and rapid growth of AI use, resulting in the need for data centres and associated industrial and logistics development, and also the competition for land between industrial logistics and data centre development, we need a planning system that's flexible enough to adapt quickly to a changing modern economy. So more flexibility. We would also ask for modernisation and standardisation of how future demand for industrial and logistics land is estimated, and these should account for suppressed demand and historic supply constraints in local plans. Will a standard method come in? I don't know. We've been pushing for it for years. There would be pros and cons, but I think that's a discussion for another day. Thirdly, we would ask that industrial and logistics development is more aligned with strategic infrastructure provision and housing growth in spatial and local plans. I alluded to earlier that, each household needs almost 7 square metres of logistics floor space, and we need to take this into account when we're planning for our housing needs. And finally, I would just say, we talk about strategic logistics a lot and freight and logistics, and the terminology seems to have changed from industrial logistics to freight and logistics without any real explanation. But I would say don't forget the mid-box units, which are very important to logistics developers, and also manufacturing and general industrial development. These also do contribute significantly to the economy and shouldn't be forgotten about.
Fantastic. Good to finish there, I think, on what additional asks might be required.
Perfect. That's fine. Thank you very much for asking me to do it.